Welcome back to Punishment of Operant Behavior. This is video part 3. And we just reviewed conditioned and unconditioned and positive and negative punishment. And so now you're going to learn some acronyms or abbreviations for these functions of consequences. And so the first one here is conditioned positive punishment. And so it looks just like conditioned positive reinforcement, except there's a P, a lowercase p, instead of a lowercase r. Okay, and same for negative conditioned punishment. Instead of an s with a lowercase r and a minus, there's an s and a lowercase p with a minus. Now remember, in the prior unit, in the discussion about reinforcement, I talked about positive unconditioned reinforcement, abbreviated as S capital R with a positive symbol here. And I said the way to remember that unconditioned has a capital R is that with the R there's an capital R there's an upside down U. U means unconditioned. Okay, so I think the way to transfer that over to these abbreviations to remember this is that when you see the when you are trying to figure out if it's an uppercase or lowercase p, think back to reinforcement. Think positive or negative. Unconditioned reinforcement will be an S with a capital R. It's capital R because of the upside down U. That's unconditioned. So unconditioned punishment must be capital P. Okay, that's the way to think about it. So positive unconditioned punishment is an S with a superscript capital P with a plus, and unconditioned negative punishment is S with a capital P and the superscript with a minus. Okay, so now I'd like you to complete the table in your guided notes pertaining to punishment in terms of provenance, direction of change in the environment, and direction of change in probability. And so you should complete this table in the same way you completed the reinforcement table in the prior unit. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to recommend pausing the video and go ahead and complete the table, and then press play in the video and I'll talk you through the answers. Okay, I'll assume you're back, and so let's fill it in. So we have positive and negative in terms of the direction of the change in the environment that characterizes that consequence. Then we have direction of change in the future probability. These are both going to be decrease. Reinforcement increases, but punishment, regardless of its provenance and whether it's positive or negative, is still going to decrease the future probability of behavior. So you would write decrease here, decrease here. You had negative over here. Conditioned is of phylogenetic provenance, so the ontogenic provenance is conditioned. You would write that in this box. And so the symbols, you'd have lowercase r's on the condition side, lowercase p's on the condition side, and then uppercase p's on the unconditioned side. So this would be S superscript lowercase p plus, and then S superscript lowercase p minus, and unconditioned would be S uppercase p superscript plus, and then S uppercase p superscript, and then a minus. Okay, objective 5 is to identify and discriminate between examples and non-examples of some variables that influence the effectiveness of punishment. So the first is contingency and consistency. Contingency refers to whether the punisher happens every time the behavior occurs. Okay, that's a consistency, right? So if the punisher happens every time the behavior occurs, we would say then the punisher is being delivered consistently. Okay, so the first bullet there, does the punisher happen every time the behavior occurs, refers to consistency. But the next one is contingency. So contingency is if and only if the behavior occurs, the consequence is delivered. Okay, so if some other behavior occurs, the consequence is not delivered. When the behavior occurs, if it's the behavior targeted for punishment, then you deliver the consequence. And let's say the only time you deliver the consequence was when the behavior targeted for punishment occurs, but sometimes the behavior occurs and the consequence isn't delivered. So it's like every other time or sometimes the consequence is delivered. Well, that would be inconsistent, but contingent. So you want punishment to be both contingent and consistent, meaning it only occurs if the behavior occurs, and every time the behavior occurs, the consequence is delivered. Okay, so the schedule of punishment is the rule about which behavior is punished and when. Okay, so we would use the FR1 means that every time the behavior occurs, the punisher is delivered. FR2 is every 2 times the behavior occurs, the punisher is delivered. VR2 means on average, every 2 times the behavior occurs, the punisher is delivered. Now, if you want punishment to be very effective, you want to deliver it every single time that the behavior occurs. And gradually you can start to fade out punishment by not delivering it every time the behavior occurs, but initially you have to. And a lot of times that's a breakdown in the effective use of punishment, is that folks are not consistent and they don't deliver the punisher every time the behavior occurs. If the contingency is weak, and sometimes the consequence is delivered for some other behaviors, that's another way that punishment procedures are weakened, and people try to do it that way and it doesn't work, it doesn't function as punishment, and then they conclude, punishment doesn't work. Well, it's usually just because they didn't deliver it contingently, they weren't consistent, they didn't deliver it every time. So punishment parameters, now these are qualities of punishment, not the schedule. It's called qualitative or quantitative aspects of punishment severity, independent of the schedule, such as for contingent exercise, how many push-ups the learner has to do, or how long are they going to be in timeout. More severe is generally more effective, so more push-ups or longer period of time in timeout generally is going to be more effective. So if folks don't require, for example, in the case of contingent exercise, for the learner to engage in enough exercise, or in the case of timeout, they're there too briefly, well, that can weaken the effectiveness of punishment, and then the person trying to use punishment can conclude that punishment doesn't work. Well, they just haven't used it correctly or effectively. Okay, the immediacy of punishment. Punishment should be immediate. The consequence that you deliver should be delivered less than 1 second. So the behavior occurs, and less than 1 second later you deliver that consequence. That's immediate. And so the bigger the temporal interval, or the less temporally contiguous the behavior and the consequence are, the less immediate it is. So 10 seconds, 1 minute, or 1 day, those are delayed consequences. Delayed consequences, a delay in the delivery of the consequence, is going to weaken the effectiveness of punishment if the consequence functions as punishment or a punisher. So sometimes language can bridge spatial and temporal gaps between behavior and punishment. Okay, so in other words, when the behavior occurs, in some cases you can tell the learner what they're going to lose later, or what's not going to happen later in time. And by you telling them that, that can function as punishment for the behavior, because of its relation to the loss of, for example, the loss or addition of some type of events in the future. Okay, availability of alternative reinforcement and the effort required to produce it. So whether you arrange for reinforcement of behavior the student otherwise should be demonstrating. If you provide alternative reinforcement for appropriate behavior that is alternative to the behavior that's being punished, well, that can increase the effectiveness of punishment. Especially if that alternative behavior is very easy to do. It's very easy for them to engage in some other behavior that's not being targeted for punishment, then your punishment procedure is going to be much more effective. The reinforcement history of the punished behavior. So if the behavior is new, and it was just shaped up by the environment, then it's easier to punish that behavior than to punish a behavior that's been reinforced for a long time. New behavior will decelerate more rapidly than well-established behavior. And how and when were reinforcement provided for the punished behavior? That's an important question to be asked in terms of the history of the behavior. And if the behavior is still being reinforced and you're trying to punishment, that's going to weaken the effectiveness of the punishment procedure. So what I've listed for you are variables that influence the effectiveness of punishment. So when folks conclude that punishment doesn't work, which is a myth, in most cases they have a history of either trying to use consequences non-contingently, inconsistently, with an inappropriate schedule, with weak parameters, not delivering the consequence immediately, and continuing to reinforce either the behavior that's being targeted for punishment or failing to reinforce alternative behavior and not aligning all the characteristics of the punishment procedure with the history of the behavior, not using a procedure that will be proportional to how long the behavior has been occurring and how long it's been reinforced. Okay, ASR 11. If and only if the rat pressed the lever, a shock was delivered. The shock occurred every time the rat pressed the lever. This scenario exemplifies which variable that influences the effectiveness of punishment. A. Contingency and consistency. B. Schedule. C. Parameters. D. Availability of alternative reinforcers. Or E. Immediacy. A couple more seconds. Alright, I'll close the poll. Answer here is A. Contingency and consistency. ASR 12. The rat was trained with food pellets to press the left lever and the right lever. Then the right lever ceased to produce food. Instead, it produced a shock every time the rat pressed it. The left lever continued to produce food pellets, and right lever pressing reduced rapidly. This scenario exemplifies which variable that influences the effectiveness of punishment. A. Contingency and consistency. B. Schedule. C. Parameters. D. Availability of alternative reinforcers. Or E. Immediacy. Give you a few more seconds. Alright, I'll close the poll, and the answer here is D. Availability of alternative reinforcers, because only pressing the right lever produces the shock. Pressing the left lever continues to produce food pellets, which is alternative reinforcement. ASR 13. The shock failed to completely reduce lever pressing, so the experimenter increased the intensity of the shock. This scenario exemplifies which variable that influences the effectiveness of punishment. A. Contingency and consistency. B. Schedule. C. Parameters. D. Availability of alternative reinforcers. Or E. Immediacy. Give it a few more seconds. Alright, I'll close the poll. The answer is C. Parameters. ASR 14. Within 0.5 seconds, the shock was delivered for lever pressing, and the probability of the rat's lever pressing decreased in the future. Later, the experimenter arranged for the shock to be delivered 3 seconds after the lever press, which exemplifies manipulation of which variable? A. Contingency and consistency. B. Schedule. C. Parameters. D. Availability of alternative reinforcers. Or E. Immediacy. A couple more seconds. Alright, I'll close the poll. The answer here is E. Immediacy. ASR 15. At first, the shock was delivered for every lever press. Then the experimenter delivered a shock only if the lever was pressed twice. This scenario exemplifies which variable that influences the effectiveness of punishment. A. Contingency and consistency. B. Schedule. C. Parameters. D. Availability of alternative reinforcers. Or E. Immediacy. Give a couple more seconds. Alright, I'll close the poll, and the answer here is schedule. First, the experimenter reinforced every response. Then the experimenter only first the experimenter punished every response. Then the experimenter only punished every 2 responses. So that's a change in this schedule. Okay, that concludes this video part. I'll see you in the next video part, beginning with Objective 6.